Nice to be with you again. My name is Michael Millerman. Millermanschool.com is where I teach online. Some other places you can find me: Substack, Twitter, and YouTube. No surprise, I'm going to be having a kind of laid back video here, enjoying a Rocky Patel Decade Toro cigar. Non-Cuban, but a nice cigar. Thank you to Alex, a friend of mine who gave me a box. And the main thing I want to do with you today is go over my latest piece of writing called Philosophy and Finance, published at miskatonian.com. You're going to see links in the description where you can find this and other articles. And this is one that I wrote, and it's roughly, you could say, about the relationship of theory and practice in philosophy, more specifically about whether philosophy has anything to offer to entrepreneurs, business people, investors, and so on. And I enjoyed writing it. I hope that you enjoy listening to me read it, going over it, and all of that, presenting it. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so I don't have my glasses on because I don't want there to be a lot of reflection. You see, I'm not where I normally am, but I can't read without my glasses on, so put those on, okay? The most famous philosopher of the last century once called philosophy sovereign but useless knowledge. But what good is something useless? With a strong and justified prejudice against uselessness in their hearts, men and women of practical affairs have always looked with some suspicion upon a discipline that wastes intellectual resources on questions that cannot be transferred into efficient application. Philosophers, for their part, when they have not turned up their noses to such objections, have from time to time, therefore, felt compelled to speak of the practical benefits of their otherwise purely theoretical endeavor. Okay, so let me just put it in non-written terms. Practical people are like philosophers. Why are you wasting your time asking questions that have no practical benefit? And philosophers try to give an answer, okay? Sometimes, not always. Water flows. Its flow can be used to generate electricity. What can a philosopher's thoughts generate? A long-standing answer from the classical tradition is that philosophy is an intimate part of the good life, having something to do with generating order in the human soul and in the political community. That is why Socrates said that the philosopher is the justest of men. But although a well-ordered city and soul is perhaps the highest good, it is the harder to attain the higher it is. Okay, so first answer, what is philosophy good for? It's good for order in the soul and order in the city, but that's a high bar. The highest. So the early modern thinkers wanted to deliver something less exalted, but more reliable and in greater demand: material comfort. Thus, philosophy took on the guise of science and made itself safe from persecution under the cover of the very practical benefits it provided as science. Okay, so answer number one, what's the practical benefit of philosophy? Good order in the soul, good order in the city. High, exalted, rare, standard, okay? Almost so high and so exalted as to be unattainable, actually, in practice, and therefore serves as a kind of aspiration. So the early modern philosophers lower the bar, as Leo Strauss taught all of us, lower the bar to something more common. And how do they do that? By making philosophy into a science meant to deliver material benefits. Philosophy as inquiry into the way of the world, okay, into the things of the world, the stuff of the world, into the hidden causes of the world, can be made practical through science and sold to the public as good for the public because it gives them something that everybody wants: comfort, okay? That's different from the classical high bar of a well-ordered soul. Okay, so this new science philosophy succeeded, and as it succeeded, it gradually forgot its roots in disinterested contemplation, its essential uselessness, and its splendor. Rather than succumbing to either of two extremes, one that insists that the less useful a thing is, the greater dignity it has, and another that wants to squeeze the last drop of its essence out through mere application, leaving nothing else to the imagination, Philosophy, or those of us interested in it, should take up the middle ground that Aristotle said is the place of virtue. Pause. So we don't need to treat philosophy as like, oh, it would be it's a denigration of philosophy to speak about its usefulness. No, that's too extreme. But at the same time, you don't want to say anything that's not useful has no worth. That's an extreme. Okay. So we want some sort of sweet spot. The middle ground that Aristotle said is the place of virtue. Courage is more than cowardice and less than rashness. And you don't want to be either a spendthrift or a stooge. So in other words, in Aristotle's ethics, a virtue is a mean between two extremes. You don't want to be skimpy. Is that the right word? You don't want to like be a penny pincher, and you don't want to go ahead and like blow all your money on completely stupid things. The virtue concerning the correct use of money or means is a middle. Okay. Courage means you're not a total coward, but you're also not a reckless hothead, right? It's a mean, an in-between state, okay? A middle. That's what virtue is for Aristotle, broadly speaking, in his book called The Ethics, okay? So courage is more than cowardice, less than rashness. You don't want to be either a spendthrift or a stooge. As in, sorry, that's supposed to be Scrooge, I think. But you know what I mean? I got to get that fixed. A Scrooge, you know what I mean? As in archery, the sweet spot is the center. We're closer to the target when we acknowledge that philosophy has a special dignity as both a purely contemplative affair and a practice that improves practice. If you've read much Plato, and if you haven't, take my word for it, right about now, in other words, as I talk about a practice that improves practice, you should hear the little voice of Socrates starting to interrogate us with the following kinds of questions. Who improves the practice of fighters? Their trainers, right? Their coaches. Who improves the practice of sailing? A good captain, a good ship's captain. Who improves the practice of collective singing? A choir master, okay? Or collective performance, a conductor, right? So why then do we look to the philosopher for improved practice and not to the various expert practitioners? You understand? So I said we should consider philosophy as something that improves practice. Normally, Socrates would say the practice of what? The practice of making people healthy, that's the doctor's affair. The practice of making people fast, that's the gym trainer's affair. You know what I'm saying? So why do we look to the philosopher for improved practice and not to the various expert practitioners? When it comes to business, entrepreneurship, and money making, okay, partially I was asked to write, on the topic of philosophy and finance or philosophy for entrepreneurs. That's why I zeroed in on this in particular. So when it comes to business, entrepreneurship, and money making, what, if anything, can the philosopher add? See the question? And by the way, if you don't know Socrates, you don't know Plato, you haven't read much of that, hopefully that gives you a taste of what happens when people talk to Socrates. For example, Alcibiades, I'm about to mention him. I'm about to mention Alcibiades, the great Alcibiades. There's a dialogue called Alcibiades. The first one, Alcibiades 1. And he's also a character in Plato's Symposium, okay? He was very lovable, likable, good conversation partner, okay, for Socrates. You should read that and look at it. But he tells Socrates that he wants to be a ruler. Okay, he wants to be a ruler, let's say, over the Athenians. And Socrates asks him, a ruler over men in what capacity? Like a ruler of men doing what? A ruler of a men rowing a boat? That's what you call a captain, okay? You know what I mean? A ruler of men building a house? Well, you call that, I don't know, whatever you call that, foreman. So that's the kind of question that Socrates asks. And so now we're wondering, okay, when it comes to business, entrepreneurship, and money making, what, if anything, can the philosopher add? There once was a great man in Athens called Alcibiades. He was the most beautiful, daring, and promising youth. Socrates, by contrast, was old and ugly. There's a funny image you've probably seen online. You may have, or you could find it if you want to. I guess it's taken from a student's perspective in a lecture. And they're looking at a slide up in the front of the classroom. And the slide says, the problem of Socrates, or what is the problem of Socrates, or what was the problem of Socrates? And the first bullet point is he was ugly. Okay, you should find that. It's funny. I had it on my Republic course, platocourse.com, but I took it down because it seemed kind of unprofessional, but it's pretty funny. Yeah, hold on. I'm going to pause the video and find it for you. All right, I found it. You see that? What's the problem of Socrates? He's ugly, okay? So obviously there's more to it than that, but that's kind of funny. So yes, he was old and ugly. The kind of people who look down on Socrates, old, ugly philosopher, often look up to Alcibiades, right? Young, daring, dashing man of action. And yet Alcibiades admired or even loved Socrates, as, for example, you learn when reading Plato's Symposium. So, on the authority of Alcibiades himself, Socrates deserves our attention. Similarly, the kind of people who look down on philosophy often look up to financial success, right? For them, philosophy is like mental masturbation, whereas financial success is the real deal. And yet, you can often find among the financially successful an admiration for philosophy, one that even gives it some credit for financial success. So, what have businessmen, entrepreneurs, and moneymakers themselves said about what philosophy contributes to their practice? All right, take these off for a minute. No, keep them on. So, you see the question, right? We've got philosophy is somehow useless, and yet philosophers have made a case for its usefulness. Number one, good order of the soul and of the city. That was our sort of classical answer at its most exalted, beautiful, and dignified. Then we had, slightly lower common denominator of wanting a security, safety, comfort, and all of that, which you get by doubling down on that part of philosophy that you could call natural philosophy or science. Okay, so philosophy begins to deliver practical results through its science, in effect. All right. As I said, there are these two extremes of like totally rejecting the practical dimension or going so far into the expectation of a practical benefit that you lose sight of philosophy's own inherent dignity, the one that has to do with not necessarily practical or useful, applicable ends. Okay, so we're looking for a sweet spot. That's why we talked about Aristotle, the virtue as a mean between two extremes. All right. So then we asked the question, what can philosophy contribute to practice? And it seemed like a weird question because it seemed like you should just go to the specific practitioners, as I mentioned, right? And then using this example of Socrates and Alcibiades, we said, look, there are some cases where if you're like anti-philosophy, you're pro this thing. And it's kind of surprising if that thing that you're for is itself pro-philosophical. Does that make sense? So like you don't like Socrates, you like Alcibiades, and yet Alcibiades loved Socrates. So we get referred back to Socrates when we go to Alcibiades. So likewise, I said, why don't we try to figure out when we say no to philosophy as kind of useless, having no application on all of that, and instead we go to where the action is, particularly where the money is, business, finance, entrepreneurship, wheeling, dealing, inventing, creating, founding, establishing, and all of that, we see, among those people, there are many who give credit to philosophy. So we're referred back to philosophy on the authority of the practitioners themselves.